Okay, good morning.
Morning.
Yes, we got to go to sponsor. Yeah, and there's going to be a lot more people coming. Evidently, they're stuck somewhere in the bowels of the Red Line. And I'm going to ask my AV people, is the webcast on? Thumbs up. All right, hi there. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum. I've been here, my gosh, almost 12 years by the end of the summer. And the China Environment Forum, for coming on 14 years, has been bringing together government, NGO, business, and researchers and journalists. Got to add those guys on here now, from around the world to look at China's energy and environmental challenges. And those of you that have been hanging around me for a long time know that I have a big passion for water, dissertation on it and all that stuff. We won't go into it because that would be total nerdsville. And for many years in the work that we do, we try to identify gaps. Find out who's doing what and what are the gaps. And one huge gap that I've noticed quite a few years ago is no one was looking at the water energy nexus. And it's not even a super big topic here. It's getting big, right? Rio Plus 20 is bringing the ag, energy, water issue together. So it's good. So we're kind of like riding ahead of that wave there. And so I was kind of looking around, and then I'd gotten to know these fun folks out in Michigan. Don't underestimate Midwesterners. From a group called Circle of Blue. And in a minute they'll give you a full intro, but it's an NGO that's affiliated with Pacific Institute that tries to put a face on the global freshwater crisis. And I worked with them. Some of you might have come to our karst meetings, but we did a multimedia website on karst water challenges in China and also on desertification. Now these guys, they're a bunch of journalists. They go out and they get the story, and he will tell us more shortly, Carl Ganto, the director of it. But they did a story called Choke Point US last year that was looking at how energy development was impacting water in the United States. And we brought them here last September, and they gave a packed room full of presentation. It was really amazing and shocked a lot of people, and it takes a lot to shock people in DC. And so that was even before then, though, I'd been talking with them, and we succeeded in getting support from the Energy Foundation, USAID, and Vermont Law School to do research in China, send a team of, am I telling this or you tell this? I can tell this, okay. So I have the microphone, so I am telling it. Sent a team of 4 teams of journalists, photographers, videographers to China for 3 weeks in December to try to find out what's going on and how is energy impacting water. I mean, I think I've figured out at long last the reason no one's been doing work on this issue is no one had the information. Well, guess what? We have the information now. So as I'm going around and telling people in the China Environment Forum Mafia, you have the information. The challenge is being tossed out to all of you to figure out how to do work in this area. You don't know yet, but those of you sitting here and watching in Webland will be much smarter at the end of these 2 hours. I'm going to ask Carl, why don't you come up and introduce the project, and I'll say a couple of words about the speakers, and then we're going to get this show on the road.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. It's great to be back at the Wilson Center. Started here about 6 years ago, working on the Navigating Peace program on water and foreign policy here. So with the Environmental Change and Security program and the China Environment Forum. So it's really exciting to be back. And it's also exciting just to tell you a little bit about Circle Blue, just a tiny bit. What we get to do is we get to work with people like Jennifer, Keith, Jeff, the whole panel here. I call them our superheroes. And I don't use that term lightly. I call them our superheroes because we use superheroes in journalism, science, data, and design, because the big challenges on the planet, the only way we're going to solve them and respond to them is by frontline knowledge and contextualizing that knowledge. So that's what we get to do. And I'll take you around the world in about a minute here. I'll show you just a little bit about what we've done. So our very first project about 4.5 years ago, our first big project, we've been around for 10 years, was in the Tehuacan Valley of Mexico. And we found a region that was really a metaphor for water issues around the world. Now, water issues are very, very complex, and they intersect pretty much everything we care about. Anything, any sector, health, environment, economy, you name it, water is at the core somewhere. So the Tehuacan Valley is a perfect place to start because you had an area where it was being affected by climate change, being affected by water extraction, by factory farming, but also you had heroes. You had people who were learning how to plant ancient grains that were much more drought resistant. And they were doing this because they had to. One interview we did that was a real eye-opener for our reporter, a senior correspondent from Newsweek that we brought along, was the fact that the young people were leaving because their jobs were literally drying up. The region where corn was domesticated, corn couldn't grow anymore. So they were leaving, they were going to Mexico City, and they were going north to the U.S. So our immigration flood back then, flood or drought, was coming because of water. That was one of the big realizations from there. Inner Mongolia, the world is connected. So the dust in this shepherd's hands is blowing across. This is the dust that you see in Beijing. This is some of the dust that we see in Los Angeles. So we have an astronaut who's on our board. He actually took pictures of these dust storms drifting across. So the world is connected. It's connected by water or a lack of water. Australia, talk about connectedness. Australia's Murray-Darling Basin. We all heard about it in the news. We were there with teams of reporters and photographers and researchers looking at the Murray-Darling Basin. This was a story that was unfolding for 12 years, a drought that really was not on the global radar. But what we saw was a metaphor, again, of one of the world's food baskets drying up. The entire rice industry is now 3% of what it was. So an entire industry entirely remade. In fact, we talked to one reporter in Australia from the Australian Broadcasting Company who was afraid to go on the air. This is the power of journalism. Afraid to go on the air with the story again and again and again because she was afraid that another farmer would take their life. It was that dire. The news was that dire. So Jennifer mentioned karst. We did a project with the China Environment Forum. How many people know what karst is? Okay, karst limestone, okay? Very exciting topic, but actually it is. In many parts of the world, a lot of the water supply is held in limestone underground. So we tried to put a face on this huge, huge interesting story, particularly in Yunnan province where it's drier and where the water literally is draining 1,000 feet underground. I took this picture. Behind me is a 600-foot sinkhole that opened up in this farmer's field, 600 feet deep. We threw a rock, listened 12 seconds before it hit the bottom. Huge challenges around the world, but one of those big challenges, and what we like to do at Circle Blue and the China Environment Forum and here at the Wilson Center, is take a step back. First, go really local, be able to put a face on the issue, but then take a step back and look and see where the connections are. So Jennifer mentioned Choke Point US, the water energy nexus, okay, that intersection, that collision, that struggle. So what would it look like if we took a look at China, at Choke Point, China? So I want to introduce, Jennifer will introduce our cast up here, but that's what you'll hear about today.
Good. Yay, Carl. So yeah, I was like the superhero because I'm like picturing like these men in spandex here and capes. so what we have today, the first Keith Schneider is going to kick us off. He's our storyteller today. And so he manages the Circle Blue news desk and participates in multimedia story development, reporting, editing, and production. And the key thing is that we hope that after this meeting, not during on your little iPhones and stuff, okay, but on the Circle Blue website, there are 10 out of 12, maybe there are going to be 13 stories, multimedia stories that he's going to be summarizing a little bit this morning, very quickly going through them. And I strongly advise you to also look at the Choke Point US story to see the comparisons. You've got the bio, so I'm going real quick here. So we're going to have, Keith is going to start us off with the Choke Point China story, what we learned in the 3 weeks, well, initially the 3 weeks in China in December, but we were back earlier in April. We spent 2 weeks, 16 presentations in 3 cities, and we even went to Ningxia, you guys. You haven't lived till you've been to Ningxia. And we also did a little bit more research and reporting there. After Keith talks, we've got Jeff Erickson. He's here in D.C. He leads sustainability's work in the energy sector and has expertise and experience working with numerous industries, including, appropriately enough, the electric utilities, oil, gas, and all these good guys. And he's gonna talk about like kind of the business person's response to this information. It's kind of important, kind of the business world. Part of the solution, okay? That's you guys. And then closing us out is the closing pitcher or closing superhero is Jeremy Schweifels. He's a regular presenter here. He's over at EPA, and he's a senior analyst in their Clean Air Markets division. And many of you know that, I mean, he's been hanging out in China for a long time, doing work on the emission measurement programs, air quality. And basically he's Mr. Coal. And we kind of felt that if we're talking about energy development in China, that it would be really ridiculous not to have someone who knows about coal, because that's the story. So he's going to give us a few interesting factoids about coal to think about. And now that all the people who were delayed by the red line are filtering on in the room. So we're going to, Keith, I'd like you to come on up here, and we'll scooch out of the side so we can.
Thank you, Jennifer, for having us back in Washington. Before I start, I wanted to introduce some of the members of our team. This is Peter Marsters, who came with us, organized our April tour. Nadia Ivanova is one of our reporters. Next to Nadia is Molly Walton, who helped us put together Choke Point US. And over there in the corner is Christina Larson, who wrote our karst story. So, and these folks up here have been helped us design the program for both Choke Point China, some in Choke Point US. And Jeremy was a really big help in helping us design our whole how we approached Choke Point China. All right. Go. We wanted to answer one question. We had one question when we went to China, which is that how is this country, which is growing at a rate that's never before been seen in human history, how is it doing so, despite the fact that it doesn't have a lot of water. Its water resources are limited, and I wanted to give you very quickly a kind of a geographic explication of China. China has 80% of its water in the southern part of the country, below the Yangtze River. So 80% of its water is in the south, but most of its energy reserves are in the north. So we want to answer the question, how are they growing this fast, despite the fact that they have this geographic mismatch, and the fact that those energy reserves in the north are coal, and coal uses a ton of water. Coal is the largest consumer of water in the United States, and it's the second largest consumer of water. Let me report. Coal is the largest industrial user of water in the United States, and it's the largest industrial user of water in China. And I want to give you some numbers. China withdraws from its environment 599 billion cubic meters of water a year. A cubic meter of water is a metric ton of water. It's 264 gallons. China has 2.42 trillion cubic meters of water to use in its lakes and its rivers and its aquifers. We found in China a good news story and a bad news story, a two-part narrative that hadn't been told before. The good news story is that its water use, its water consumption, is growing just 1% a year, about 1 billion cubic meters a year. The bad news story is it's losing 1.5% of its water a year, about 35 billion cubic meters of water a year. There are now, today, 350 billion cubic meters less water in China than there were a decade ago. That's as much water as flows by Shanghai in the Yangtze River in about 8 months. Essentially, they've lost the Mississippi River in China in 10 years. Let's talk about the good part of the narrative. How has China been able to develop the way it has? 1% water consumption increase a year over the last 15 years. In 1995, the economy since 1995 from then to now is 8 times larger in China. So they've grown an economy that's 8 times bigger than it was, but they've only used 15% more water. How have they done that? One thing that they've done very effectively is develop a new sector, a new coal combustion sector using ultra supercritical, IGCC, air-cooled. They have a much more efficient coal combustion sector than they had before. So they're using about 20% less coal and about 18% less water to generate the same amount of power in their new power plants. And they're building these new power plants everywhere. And this is a picture of a cooling tower in Ningdong, in the Ningdong Energy Base, which has a number of these highly sophisticated, state-of-the-art coal combustion plants. They're recycling a lot of water. So Beijing has 9 water recycling plants. They take their treated water and they then recycle this water for gray water. And in Beijing, in their urban core, their residential and office towers are now required to build gray water systems in order to use gray water, which is not fresh water, gray water, to wash their clothes, do their gardening, flush their toilets, those kinds of activities. Beijing has the largest water recycling program in China, and their goal is 100% water recycling, and this is one of those plants. In agriculture, China's begun to really seriously look at its water conservation measures in agriculture. Much of the irrigation in China is sand bottom canals. So they're hardening their canals. They're using less water. They're doing different kinds of drip irrigation. And the result is that the amount of water, total amount of water that they're using in China to farm is significantly lower. It's dropped from 88 to 89% in the 1980s to 62% last year. They're doing a lot in policy. This is the Yellow River. The Yellow River Basin has 55 billion cubic meters of water in it. And in 1997, it stopped going to the ocean. In fact, it dried up about 200 kilometers west of the Bohai Sea. And it caused a commotion. And the national government, the provincial governments, the Yellow River Commission got together with the universities and decided how much water they would conserve for eco-water to get the Yellow River to the ocean, which leaves about 35, 38 billion cubic meters left for every place else. And they set a per cubic meter allotment for every province. And there are 8 of those provinces? 8 provinces? 9 provinces, sorry. Nadia did our piece on this. 9 provinces in the Yellow River Basin, each of which has a water allotment. Ningxia, for instance, has a water allotment of 4 billion cubic meters a year. Inner Mongolia has about 6. Every province has that allotment, and they enforce those allotments. And it's not perfect, but it's working. The river gets to the ocean, and they measure this water pretty significantly. And we found out they're enforcing this conservation rule, which goes across 9 provinces. We visited the Bateau steel plant. This plant is 49 kilometers squared, and it employs 49,000 people. It produces 10 million metric tons of steel a year. It's one of the largest steel plants in the world. And it recycles 98% of its processed water. So it recycles 98% of the water that goes through these plants. And you cannot operate a plant like this in the western and northern provinces of China. And you can't build a plant like this in those same provinces unless you prove to the NDRC, their powerful economic development agency, that you can sustainably use the water resource. If you can't prove that you can sustainably use the water resource, they won't let you build out there. So these plants are actually doing what they say they're doing. Another way that China is trying to conserve water, replace coal, is they have this enormous clean energy manufacturing sector now underway at a blazing speed. I visited Gansu province. This is the clean energy manufacturing development base in Sichuan in northern Gansu province. Northern Gansu province has 5.5 gigawatts of wind energy now being generated, and it is tied to the grid. And all of the components for these wind towers, they're building 2,200 a year there now, are built in this manufacturing base that has 25 companies, 20,000 employees, and it's 2 years old. In 3 years, it'll have 50,000 employees and 35 companies. So China is showing something that the United States has been unable to show, which is that clean energy does produce good jobs. And the folks in Sichuan will tell you, these are young people that are working at these plants in all levels. The assistant manager of this plant that makes these wind blades is 25 years old, has a master's degree from one of the universities in Ningxia, and she's a woman. And you find these people all through this base. The other thing they're doing in Gansu is solar. We got there on a cloudy day, but they have set in Dunhuang, which is on the northern end of Gansu, a 25 square kilometer zone in which they want to produce and have set to produce 12.2 gigawatts of solar energy out of photovoltaics. Doesn't use any water. So China has 7 of these clean energy manufacturing bases underway, under construction across northern and western China, which happens to be their desert, which makes a lot of sense because both photovoltaics and wind use almost no water. One other thing that China's doing is its hydropower. Produces 213 gigawatts of hydropower currently. China wants to double its hydropower production to over 400 gigawatts. That's 400,000 megawatts. That would be 40% of the electrical energy generation in the United States. There's a good news, bad news story here, as we know. The bad news story is that they're tearing up their beautiful river valleys. There's 150 dams in various stages of construction, engineering, and permitting, 100 of them in the upper Yangtze, and 50 of them on the other rivers in this region. This is a brand new 330 megawatt power plant on the Zhulong rivers. There's 6 of these being built along a 100-kilometer stretch, and the generators of these plants are being built inside these mountains because it's too unstable on the outside to build them there because of landslides. So you have to go 6 kilometers deep into these mountains, following a road and the culvert that brings the water through, and you reach where the generators are in a room the size of the Astrodome. It's like a cathedral of high-tech industrialization in China. And our photographer took this picture, was in those generating rooms. China's moving a lot of water. This is the middle branch, the central artery of the South-North Water Transfer Project. It will open in 2014. This is part of a $66 billion project. The Eastern Canal and the Central Canal will all be ready to be opened, say the Chinese, by 2014. And by over the next 5 or 6 years, it will reach full capacity, which is over 20 billion cubic meters of water being drawn from the Yangtze River Valley to north to Tianjin and to Beijing. All of this is not enough. It's not nearly enough to solve China's energy water choke point, which principally involves coal. And here's a very clear picture of why. On the left, you'll see that in 1950, the United States produced 35 quadrillion BTUs of energy. A BTU is a thermal measurement of energy. We produced 35 quadrillion BTUs in 1950, and it took us, to 2007, 57 years to get to 100. And on the right, you'll see that China, which produced 33 quadrillion BTUs in 1995, got to 102,000. In 15 years, they did what it took us 57 years to do. And if you look at this in terms of electrical generation, which is a pretty good portion of China's total energy demand, China's now producing 967 gigawatts of power. That's what we produce in the United States. And most of it is coal. In 2020, China is scheduled to produce 1,900 gigawatts of power. They'll double it. Essentially, they're going to install the U.S. power generation system in China in 10 years. And even though they have over 700 gigawatts of power on non-fossil fuel energy, that'd be 70% of the U.S. energy production for electricity. Even though they're doing all that, it's still they haven't moved the needle much on coal. So if you go back and you look at what's happening with coal, remember, we have 599 billion cubic meters of water is being used. 1% a year increase in water consumption, even while they're growing 10% a year, is a pretty good number, but it still gets them to 670 billion cubic meters of water by 2020, right? That's a 71 billion cubic meter water increase over 10 years. And coal, come on, coal is using 23% of that. Coal is using 23% of the water currently, 138 billion cubic meters a year. By 2020, the amount of water that coal is going to be, that the water needed to fuel the coal sector is going to be 188 billion cubic meters of water. That's 28%. And most of that water is coming out of agriculture. But that's a 50 billion cubic meter a year increase in water consumption. So 50 of the 71 billion cubic meter water increase over the next 10 years in water consumption is coming out of the coal sector. So when we were in China talking to government officials and science academies and residents and journalists and all, we were able to show them that China, by the end of this decade, is facing a very significant energy supply problem, an energy shortage, not because they don't have the coal, but because where they have the coal is in their driest parts of the country, and they don't have enough water in that region, which is essentially the Yellow River Valley, to both develop the western cities. This is also a very significant agricultural food basket, and it's also the center of their coal production sector. And they're doing this. I mean, they're mining coal at a rate that the world has never seen before. 3.15 billion cubic meters a year was produced in China last year. That's triple what it was in 2000. That's more than triple what we produce in the United States. And they're very aggressively doing it. That's the Qingshan mine east of Baotou, and there produces 30 million tons a year, and they drag it out of there on trucks, 80-ton loads, 1,000 trucks a day down this road. And it shows you how tenacious they are. China uses 460 million metric tons from the same area using the same water to have an enormous coal conversion program. This is the Xinhua coal to liquids plant in Ordos. It uses 12 million metric tons of coal a year. It's also one of the largest, if not the largest, point source of CO2. It turns 4 million metric tons of coal a year into 1 million metric tons of diesel fuel, which is 20,000 barrels a day, uses 12 million metric tons of water. And when the national government authorities, learned about this loop, they shut this program down. China, as recently as 2008, was planning to build 23 of these plants, and in 2008, the national government says we can't do this because we need to build these close to our coal reserves, which is in the Yellow River Valley. We just don't have the water. So this is the largest direct technology coal to fuels plant in the world. China solved the chemistry. It's much more efficient than any coal to liquids plant that's ever been built in the world, but they haven't solved the water side of the production process. So coal to water is the choke point in China, and China has no desire yet to do anything but grow more coal. So by the end of the decade, that 3.15 billion metric tons a year will go to 4+ billion metric tons a year. Where are they going to get the water for that? That's the key that we were able to show them. And we were told, we'll figure it out. And that's an answer to this, which is the fact that they'll figure it out because this is what they really want to do. Who's been to China? So you guys know, this is the national bird, the sky crane, right? Not the whooping crane, the sky crane. So every major city has thousands and thousands of these construction projects. They're the largest market for concrete, the largest market for glass, the largest market for steel, the largest market for cars, the largest market for rail. They're the largest market for everything. And the Chinese economy is now switching from an export-oriented to a domestic-oriented because they're building the cities at a rate nobody's ever seen before. So we were asked, well, what do you think we ought to do about this at the Ministry of Water Resources? And we're like, okay, well, you could gate back your GDP, right? You could import more coal. You could begin to really make a difference in agriculture. You could clean up your water. Essentially what needs to happen is all of these, each of which means very big changes in policy and markets in China. And big changes in policy and markets in China mean big changes in every place else that's connected to China, because China is the show now. China is the big player in these markets. So what do we learn about GDP growth cutting back? They're not going to gate back their GDP. We interviewed folks all over that country. They have no desire to earn less money and work less hard. In fact, they're going as hard as they can. Importing more coal, they could import some more coal. We're all ready to sell them more coal and ship them more coal. We can sell them more coal, and that essentially means we're going to bring them more water, because it takes us a lot of water to do that too. But nobody's anticipating that they're going to import 1 billion more metric tons of coal. Why? Because the coal companies in China are every bit as powerful as the oil companies in the United States, and they have these reserves. And they want to develop these reserves. And the coal industry produces an enormous amount of jobs, an enormous amount of wealth, and it's a domestic energy source. So yeah, they'll import more coal, but basically they got to figure out how to use their coal much more efficiently, and they got to do it within 10 to 12 years. In agriculture, they have a lot of potential in agriculture. Agriculture is the largest user of water. 62% of that 599 goes into agriculture. Most of their irrigation is sand bottoms. They have a lot of opportunity to save water in agriculture. And in terms of pollution, they have several crash programs that they haven't gotten to. One of them is cleaning up their water. Well, when they get to that, they'll be able to save a bunch of water because they have a very high percentage of water that they can't use because it's too polluted, too dirty to use. So there's all kinds of opportunity there. But whatever they do here, because of the scale that they're doing here, it's going to be ginormous because they're doing these kinds of things. They're just building at scale that we've never seen before. And the last thing I'll say is they have a very significant choke point. They have a really significant problem with water scarcity. Beijing had the driest winter this winter that it's had in 60 years. It was so dry they're putting out these ordinary kinds of water drilling in order to be able to find water outside Beijing. We have a piece on our website right now by Nadia, which describes the fact that the major reservoirs outside of Beijing are 90% empty. The rivers out there are trickles because Beijing, which was 3 million people in 1980, is 20+ million people in 2010, and they're sucking up a lot of water. So they got to solve this. And Jennifer had this, I'm going to stop here. Jennifer had this really, really important thing to say to these people, to these experts and the people running the show over there. She said, you have to do this better than anybody's ever done this before. You have to figure this out and do this, because if you don't figure this out, we're all toast. So that's choke point time.
Okay, we're going to just now, we've got Jeff and Jeremy. Jeff, you're going to leap up here. He doesn't have a PowerPoint. We should leave like a cheerier slide behind you there to make a few comments, and then we're going to move on.
Great. You all right? Okay, thanks, Jennifer. I had the pleasure or the liability of following someone like Keith at another conference, and the thing that struck me most was I felt like an accordion player that was following Bruce Springsteen on stage. So I'm not going to try to compete with Keith and the story he tells, because it's really compelling, right? And it should wake everybody up and say, wow, there's a big problem. I've been working with Circle of Blue on and off for about 2 years, and pretty intensely for about the last 6 months or so. And when you talk with these folks and listen to what they say, and particularly with their most recent project, Choke Point China, and you hear them speak and you look at the reports that they put out, there's a few things that just jump out at you about China and about energy and water in China. And the first, as I reread the stories that you've been putting out for the last 2 years, the first is that it's all about coal, right? It's coal, coal, coal. One of the statements in one of the reports says there's about 425 years worth of reserves in coal in China. They're going to use them. They're going to use the coal, and they need water to clean the coal, to extract the coal, to process the coal, and to burn the coal. They don't have 425 years worth of water supply. And so that's why we have this choke point. The other thing that jumps out at you, as Keith said, is they're not going to slow down. And their latest 5-year plan, I think, actually indicates that they're going to dial back on the growth of their economy. Now, they've never been able to do that before, so I'm not convinced that they're going to do that again or over the next 5 years. Why do they want to grow their economy? Well, it depends on which side of the political fence perhaps you are. Maybe it's to improve the quality of life for their citizens, or maybe it's to increase their influence or power over global affairs. Regardless what the motivation is, they're going to grow their economy. In order to do that, they need energy. In order to get energy, they need water. Now, the dichotomy is that the more difficult it is to get the energy, the more water you need. The more difficult it is to get the water, the more energy you need. So it's a bit of a Gordian knot. And I'm not quite sure how this movie's going to end. I think that what we've seen so far is that China is putting enormous resources in to fix this problem, to relieve the choke point that they see. Working as I do on sustainability issues, where you're talking about generations, shifts over generations, I think the resources and the energy, that, no pun intended, but the work that China is putting into resolving this problem will last for only so long. So there will be a day of reckoning. The question is, how long will it be before that occurs? And what should business do in the meantime to thrive, to profit, to survive? Paul Gilding, who is a sustainability consultant, he's worked at Greenpeace and had a couple of startups, lives in Australia. He's recently put out a book called The Great Disruption, and that's his premise, is that this is all going to fall apart, folks. We've been living beyond our means, not just economically, but ecologically, and it's all going to fall apart. The question is, how long will that be, and who will be the winners and losers? So there's some uncertainties from a business perspective. First of all, we have to look at the water energy choke point not as an environmental issue that we need to resolve, not as a public relations thing that we need to resolve, not as a corporate responsibility thing, but this is a business issue, right? This is a challenge to our business. This is a constraint in resources. This is a constraint in our supply chain, if you will. And for businesses, they need to figure out how to get past that and how to deal with that. So part of what they need to do is utilize the business tools that they have to analyze risks and capture opportunities. Let me say one more thing before I talk about the role of business and what I think they should do as this choke point becomes more and more challenging for them and for the citizens of China. One of the reasons that China is going to exploit its coal reserves is because energy independence is an enormous priority for them. The things that Keith's talking about, coal to liquids, from an energy transfer standpoint, from an efficiency standpoint, that's crazy. It's crazy to convert coal into liquid fuel so that we can power our cars. But when you throw in the energy independence piece of the equation, then it starts to make sense from a political standpoint. So if an environmentalist hates the idea of energy independence, except as a way to sell environmental improvements and efficiency. But China's focus, I think, on energy independence kind of trumps a lot of other things. So what should business do? And I'm going to stick with kind of three things. And I know the folks that deal with businesses and that are in businesses are looking for very specific actions that they need to take. And you're not going to get that from me this morning. It requires an awful lot more analysis. In fact, one of the things that we are proposing to do with Circle of Blue and with another partner, GlobeScan, in the near future is to conduct a follow-up report to the Choke Point China work called Implications for Business. And we're going to do a much deeper dive on that. But let me just give you a taste of some of the things and the approaches that business should take to address the water energy choke point. And the first is change the way you look at water. In a little way, this is kind of back to the future, or perhaps more appropriately, it's forward to the past. So I'm going to say in the last 20 years, businesses have been pretty focused on what's my impact on my environment, right? You do environmental impact assessments. In order to be ISO 14001 certified, you have to understand what your impacts and aspects are. So the focus over the last 20 years has been, what are my impacts to the environment? And typically it's been inside my fence line. What are the impacts of my operations? So the first thing the business needs to do is change the way they look at that equation. It's not just what are my impacts on the environment, but what are the environmental resources and the dynamics of the changes in environmental resources. What impact does that have on my business? It's a two-way street. And constraints to my business growth are going to increasingly come down to how I'm being impacted by the environment, and not so much how I am impacting the environment. Now, interesting, one of the things that Keith didn't mention at all was climate change. And that's going to play out over the long term. And I think part of the reason that climate change wasn't front and center is because the more immediate, the more urgent issue, the more immediate impact on people and on businesses is going to be the water availability. But all this is exacerbated as the planet gets warmer. So change the way you look at water. I'm going to bring up an old term that I haven't heard in a while. We used to hear it all the time, and that's paradigm shift. Like it or not, I'm going to talk about a paradigm shift. And I think the biggest paradigm shift for businesses has to be, with respect to water, moving from a gulp paradigm to a sip paradigm. Moving from water as a commodity to water as a resource, from abundance to scarcity or limited supply. Instead of wasting water, we need to conserve water. There's this shift in paradigm. It is, and it has been for a very long time, been cheap. And it's going to become costly, not just in the direct price, but also in the indirect price. What about your business interruption risk? That makes water really expensive when you can't operate your plants or grow your markets. Paradigm shift needs to move from inside the fence line to thinking about the watershed that you operate in, and moving from your operations to your value chain. So what impact does water scarcity have on my suppliers, on my raw materials, and on my markets? Right? What markets are going to grow as a result of water scarcity, and what markets are going to shrink? Moving from a paradigm of environmental impact assessment to business risk assessment, and finally from infinite growth to ecological limits. I have two kids, and they're very different. And I think that one of the things that the Choke Point series brings out is that it's not just water, it's water and energy. Right? These are two siblings. And in a way, you have to treat them at least like close relatives, and recognize that the way you treat one of your kids has an impact on the way the other one feels and behaves. And we conducted we've conducted a series of surveys with the polling company GlobeScan over the last couple of years, and we did one on water, and we asked whether our panel of experts, about 1,500 experts on sustainability issues across the globe, felt like water and energy should be addressed separately, completely together, or kind of from a public policy standpoint, one considered the other. And overwhelmingly, they say they're connected. They need to be addressed in a connected way, both from a public policy standpoint and from a government action standpoint. So think about water and energy as siblings, and recognize the interrelationship between the two. The second thing for business: understand the implications of water and energy constraints on your business. So first, your awareness of the water energy issue. Second is a deeper understanding of what that means to your business. And then the third, of course, is to take action. So let me just talk about the understanding piece. I think there's three big questions that companies need to consider when they're looking at water. First, how much am I consuming in my operations and supply chain? And that's been going on for a long time, right? That's where I started, is this idea of what's my impact on the environment. But again, it moves from just the operations to the supply chain. The second big question is, how much are my products consuming in the use phase? I was on a webinar yesterday. I guess it was yesterday. Yeah, lots happened between now and then. I was on a webinar yesterday, and we were talking about eBay Green, and they've got a new business model where eBay Green is about selling products that are environmentally preferable or superior. And their kind of catchphrase is, the greenest product is one that already exists. Well, there's a caveat to that, and I kind of flippantly said on this webinar the other day, unless your product is a Hummer. Point being that it's not just about the environmental impact in the manufacturing phase, but it's also in the use phase. So recognize what your products are and the impacts that they have over the life cycle. And then the third big question for business is, how can my products reduce my customers' water use? And this is a market that's going to explode in China. You know, and it's everything from IT companies that are looking at providing better information, better knowledge about water use, to better irrigation and water delivery devices, and some of the green building and the low water consumption buildings that Keith was talking about. So how can my products reduce my customers' water use is that third big question that they should ask. I used to work at Mobil Oil and then for a couple years after the merger with Exxon. And I was there during the year 2000, and I was on the team that was to do the Y2K assessment. You know, and again, I'm going back and pulling stuff from the back of the rack here, the Y2K challenge. But one of the things that we did there was, you know, we had a robust process to think about what will happen if everything explodes at midnight on January 1st, 2000. And I think there's some lessons from that kind of assessment tool. First we looked at the possible impacts of a disruption. I think we can do the same thing here. You know, and those disruptions may be not enough water to run your business, but it also, and more likely, is going to be changes in policy. And again, Keith mentioned that there was this enormous coal to liquids program that was on the books and off and running, and then almost overnight the government pulled the plug and said, no, we're not going to do that anymore because there's too much water. So significant vulnerability to changes in policy, much more in China than there is in the States, because there's a thing called due process here, which is, you know, it's just a very different dynamic, and the government can do a lot of things much more quickly there than we can here. So what are the impacts of some of those changes that might occur? And then look at the likelihood of event, the consequence of the impact, and then the ability to influence and control. And then you can identify mitigation options, and those are going to be pretty broad. Going back to Y2K, you know, what happens if my factory won't open on January 1st? My factory gate can't open because the timer is incorrect. That's a whole different impact than, what if I've got one of my executives that's flying overnight and the air control system goes down, air traffic control system goes down. So manage what you can influence, find ways to influence those things, even those things that feel like they're out of your control. Sensitivity analyses are important, product line evaluations, supply chain vulnerabilities. These are the things that are core business tools that can be applied to a core business problem that's kind of dressed up like an environmental issue. So my suggestion is treat this as a business risk, treat this as a business issue, rather than separately and differently as an environmental issue. The third thing for business then, after becoming aware and understanding the impacts, is to invest, right? To take action, to invest in risk management and opportunity capture. And there's questions that need to be asked there. They kind of go back to what I said just a minute ago. How can I most effectively reduce my vulnerabilities? Should I invest in the ability to go off-grid, right? Solar. So if you look at from an operational perspective, the economics may not work out, but if you look at it from a perspective of business interruption, then some of these things like significant reductions in water and energy use or in alternative sources of energy start to make a whole lot more sense. And then, of course, the sensitivity analysis, well, I think it's going to go up $1. What if it goes up $5? What happens when oil goes to $500 a barrel? What happens when my water allocation in my area is cut in half? What's that going to do to my business? Finally, last advice is to engage. Companies don't operate in a vacuum, either in China or here or anywhere else. And so there's an opportunity and a need to engage with industry peers, with folks across your value chain, with governments, and with communities to develop solutions that work for everybody. Navigating it won't be easy. It won't be done overnight. But I think there's an opportunity. There will be winners and losers. But I think if you address these issues in a robust way, in a way that fits your business, you'll come out ahead in the long run. Thank you.
Can we go do a fancy schmancy computer switch here as my AV guy? I'm not going to unplug anything because I tend to break it. There he is. He's leaping out of the chair there. Are you feeling smarter already, everyone? And we're going to talk about coal. Are you all set?
Set.
As soon as it switches out. And because coal, okay, keep in mind, coal is sexy, you guys. Okay? Because a lot of people think, oh, coal. Everyone, because the last year we've been doing these meetings called Cooperative Competitors, doing a lot on clean energy. And wind and solar, everyone gets that spring in their step. But when you start talking about coal, it's not fun. Coal's not fun. But it is, as you've kind of picked up here now, it is the problem. And here we go. There's some random pair of glasses here. Do these belong to someone? Keith's, okay. All right. So Jeremy, how long have you been playing with coal?
About a decade.
A decade. 10 years of frolicking with coal. You never knew. And he's actually doing, I could he's actually doing a PhD at Tsinghua University. And guess what it's about?
Coal?
Coal, yes. We got coal stuff. Okay.
Good.
All right, you good?
I'm good. Well, as Jennifer said earlier, I'm an air guy, so I guess I'm feeling a little out of my element in more ways than one. But in the U.S., I work in a group that regulates coal-fired power plants, focused on air quality and pollution control. And about a decade ago, we received some requests for technical assistance from the Chinese, at the time, the State Environmental Protection Administration. So we've been looking at the air quality and pollution control issue for those 10 years. And I have to admit, we really haven't focused much on the water side of it, but addressing air quality requires a lot of water, believe it or not. And so what I hope to do is give you a little introduction about where that water is being used and some of the challenges that China will face. I won't go as broad as Keith has done. I'm going to kind of drill down a little bit, but I'll try not to put you to sleep. I guess some of the important things to think about when looking at coal, water is really necessary for the entire life cycle, starting with the mining to the processing. Much of this coal is washed, transportation. Anybody who's been to Shanghai, been along the Bund, I'm sure you've seen the ships, the barges go by with the limestone, the gravel, the coal. It's also used to manage the coal stocks. So the coal piles outside the plants, you'll see they're constantly, it's almost like the farmer's fields. They're getting irrigated. Once the coal goes in, it's turning water into steam. That steam then needs to be condensed back down. Water's used to cool that steam. Then as the flue gases, the pollution, goes through the plant, SO2 controls, and now, more common in China, NOx controls, are using a lot of water as well. So I'm going to go through each of those in a little bit, but really there are, I think in terms of water, there are three main issues for a power plant. The first is water availability. Obviously, these are large consumers. If we look at, actually Keith has much better data on China than I do, so I'm going to focus my initial data on the US just to kind of provide you a little bit of context. If we look at water availability and the water demands for coal-fired power plants, in the US, roughly half, a little under half, of all water withdrawals are used for thermoelectric power plants, coal, natural gas, biomass, nuclear. But if we actually look at the consumption of the water, it's roughly 5 to 10% at the plants. But if you factor in the mining, coal washing, transport, it can go up to about 15% of all coal water consumption is for power plants. So why this discrepancy? Well, the main reason is cooling. In the US, up until the early 70s, a lot of our cooling systems were open loop or once through, where the water would be taken from the river, nearby river. Sometimes some of it's salt water if it's along the coast. And it's used to condense that steam so it can be reheated again in the power plant. If you look at the withdrawal rates, a nuclear plant can use up to 60,000 gallons of water per megawatt hour generated. Or they can withdraw that much, but their actual consumption is only about 400 gallons. Most of that is returned to the river. One of the main problems with that water, though, is it's about 20 to 30 degrees higher than the normal water temperature. So that can lead to a number of water quality as well as wildlife issues. But since the early 70s in the US, most power plants have had to go to this closed loop system where they just continue reusing the water for a number of cycles, but then as the sediments and other pollutants concentrate, they purge parts of the system. So that's the consumption part. Here, instead of 60,000 gallons per megawatt hour, we're talking about roughly 500 to 1,000 on a nuclear plant. On a coal plant, 300 to 600. So there's tremendous potential to reduce the use of water or the withdrawals of water by going to this closed loop system. And most power plants in China, all of the new ones, but most of the large plants have this type of closed loop system. The easiest way to identify those plants is they have those big hyperbolic towers with a lot of steam pouring out of them. The second, water availability is number one for withdrawals. The second one is the water consumption, which I talked about. And then the third is really the water quality. And that's one of the big challenges many coal-fired power plants, really around the world, but in particular in China, face. Because most of the waterways, we've seen the articles that many of the rivers don't meet industrial water quality standards. Well, these boilers have to have ultra pure water. As a result, it's very expensive to clean this water. It also takes a lot of energy to clean this water. If we look at within the power plant, cooling is certainly the most dominant user of water. This scale is actually logarithmic, so it's a significant difference between the cooling, the SO2 controls, and the steam. I want to focus more on this second one, the SO2 controls, because I think it's really a story that hasn't been addressed much. Now, is it the major user? Obviously not. Cooling is the biggest source. But as power generation grows in China, the capacity to generate power, so do the SO2 controls. And now in the 12th five-year plan, with new NOx control requirements, we're going to see more and more of a technology called selective catalytic reduction, which essentially you're injecting ammonia into the flue gas to reduce your nitrogen oxides. But in China, most of the power plants they're not using direct ammonia because it's hazardous to transport, it's difficult to store, it's expensive to store. So they're using a ammonia-based product called urea, which requires steam to separate it into ammonia. So that's going to be a rapidly growing area. Again, is it a huge consumer of steam? No. But as it grows, it's going to become more and more important. Another issue is that if you look at the different generating technologies, the different types of coal-fired power plants, they all use different amounts of water. They have different efficiencies. If we look at a traditional subcritical coal plant, which is the most common type of plant that we have in the US, it uses significantly more water than a supercritical, which is more efficient and it can convert more of that heat into energy or into electricity. But the newer technologies, which China is building rapidly, like IGCC, use even more or even less water per megawatt hour. So there's a good news story there. They're also replacing many of the older, smaller, inefficient boilers, which were using a technology that used a lot of water for cooling. But the story's not quite as simple as replacing the old high water consuming technologies with newer, more efficient, less water consuming technologies. Those old boilers being shut down were very flexible in the type of fuel they used. So much of the fuel didn't have to be washed and cleaned before it reached the plant. Now with these new plants, in particular the supercritical, they're very sensitive to changes in fuel. So the fuel has to be washed, consuming tremendous amounts of water. if we look at the picture in China for electricity generating capacity, it's grown rapidly. Keith talked about some of the projections. We're looking over the next 5 years, thermal capacity will probably increase about 260 gigawatts. That's NDRC's plan. And much of that will have SO2 controls and NOx controls. So the water demands are going to grow not just for cooling, but also for pollution controls. So some of the challenges, okay, this rapid expanse of coal-fired power plants. The new SO2 limits for the 12th five-year plan ratchet down emissions levels beyond the 11th five-year plan levels. So that's going to require more of these control technologies, more water use, the new NOx limits I mentioned, but also the new CO2 targets and the work that China's starting to put on the ground projects in carbon capture and storage. Well, carbon capture and storage can be a very effective way of storing carbon and reducing the CO2 emissions, but it increases water consumption at the power plant by 50 to 100%. So again, it's kind of there's an advantage and a disadvantage. It's not a simple story. And that's why I'm not a journalist. I can't simplify it and present a compelling narrative. Yeah. And then water quality is one of the other issues. So some of the ways that China's addressing this, I think Keith did a great job going through some of the really innovative projects. And I'll kind of reiterate what Jennifer said and suggest you go read those 10 or 12 articles because there's some great information in there. But one of the key things is energy efficiency. The energy efficiency targets of the 11th and 12th five-year plan reduce electricity consumption. By reducing electricity consumption, you reduce the water need at the coal-fired power plants. And actually, let me caveat that. They're not reducing consumption. They're reducing the rate of growth in consumption. This closed-loop cooling I talked about. Also, dry cooling. China is has one of the largest deployments of dry cooling technologies. So instead of using water to cool the steam from the power plant boiler, they're using air, much in the way that your car's radiator does. And in fact, the cooling tower that you showed looks like that's a dry cooling tower. This is also another technology which works more like your car's radiator, which has fans underneath. The move from subcritical to supercritical and ultra supercritical also reduces water demand, as well as the move to IGCC. You mentioned the recycling, which it's not just apartment buildings and industrial facilities, but also power plants are doing a lot of water recycling and reusing wastewater. So water from sewage treatment plants is being used as water at many power plants. And then the other thing not on this slide that I'd like to throw out there as well, although I haven't seen studies that point to the energy consumption to supply water in China, U.S. studies show a California study shows about 25% of electricity is used just to transport and treat water. So the water saving efforts in China will also reduce energy consumption, or at least reduce the growth in energy consumption. So it's this positive feedback loop. By improving energy efficiency and reducing water consumption, you reduce water needs at power plants, and you reduce electricity demand as well. So I think there are a lot of good things happening, but as with so many other issues, the rapid rate of growth presents some very difficult challenges. But if the lessons from the 11th five-year plan show us anything, is that China's leaders are willing to marshal the resources necessary and experiment with a number of technologies to try and identify the solutions. So, thank you very much.
As we get set, one thing, over the years, I have had some, prior to this project, I did take, I took a guy from California, actually, from Pacific Institute, which is the mothership of Circle of Blue, and I had him give a talk on a little bit of what Jeremy said at the end about if you save water, you save power. We gave this talk at the Shanghai Environmental Protection Bureau, and I've never seen Chinese environmental protection officials look so excited. Yeah, I mean, but and same thing, you know, that, but because it's and when we gave these, again, 16 talks over 2 weeks in 3 cities, it wasn't just, you know, they weren't just being polite. I mean, people were really, jaws were dropping, and, you know, these were researchers. Shanghai Academy of Environmental Sciences said that they want to start a new research program on this. It just like bringing, I guess, the siblings together hadn't really come out. So, okay, time for you guys to ask questions. I've got Nadia with a microphone and Ken Lieberthal on the other side. So, and Sife, can you hand it to Ken, please? Even though I just identified him. Do identify yourself and where you're from so the speakers kind of know.
Sure. Ken Lieberthal, Brookings Institution. Thank you very much. This was utterly fascinating. It's a little startling to hear, as Jennifer just said, that the Chinese had not put this together because it's been such a central set of issues for them, and they certainly have a long history of being concerned about water. So, but anyway, I have 3 quick either comments or questions. One of you mentioned that China has 400 and some odd years of coal reserves available. I was just at a Shanghai coal company research facility, a new research facility they had, and they estimate now China has 65 years of coal reserves available, of which half consist of lignite. That's a huge differential. I don't know whether that reflects different estimates of rate of growth or what, but I'd appreciate a comment on that. Secondly, CCS generally requires about somewhere around an additional third of the energy that a plant produces in order to capture the carbon and sequester it. But if I heard you correctly, you said it would require 50 to 100% more water use, and I'd appreciate your explaining that. And then finally, you said at the beginning that this was Keith, that water use increases by 1% per year. Water supply goes down by 1.5% per year. And my question is whether you see that continuing. In other words, does that assume that the kinds of efforts China has been making will continue into the future? And when you put it all together, you would still anticipate this mismatch. And if so, then at what point does this require a kind of fairly radical break? In other words, the story I heard here was despite unbelievable efforts, they're still on an unsustainable path. And so I guess I'd ask you to comment a little bit about how you square that circle and whether squaring it fundamentally is going to end up with coal imports because of a lack of other sufficient alternatives. Thank you.
So we had a water supply, we had a coal reserve, and the middle one was? CCS. So let me do the latter one, and you guys do the reserves. The meteorologists and the scientists that we talked to on on water supply, anticipate that China is going to continue, with breaks in wet weather and dry weather. But they've had this continuous dry weather cycle, which they blame on climate change. Mm-hmm. And it's very significant in the north, but it's becoming more significant in the south. 80% of that 350 billion cubic meters of water lost over the last decade, 80% of it came out of the wet south. That's very significant for their hydropower development. So the moisture in their rivers that they're damming is going down, which means that the amount of energy that they can generate in those turbines is going down. And the emergency moment came last year during a very significant drought in Sichuan and other provinces, and we were able to get the data out of some of the big hydropower companies and saw that some of those turbines, some of those power dams were producing 30% less energy. And what does that mean? That means they're bringing coal south, which means they're jamming their railroads, which are already jammed. They got 80,000 coal trains a day moving, and they only move 2/3 of their coal by train. The other third is by truck, and we all heard about the 160 whatever kilometer traffic jam they had a year ago. So, this is a country that's bursting at the seams. And while we see the energy water choke point as one of those very significant impediments to this country's modernization, but also because they're the only industrialized government that I know of on earth right now that can move, can respond at the speed, at the velocity of change in the world. So this is, I'm not a pessimist about this, but what we were able to show them is that this is something they need to deal with. And that goes to your first comment. They're hydrologists around the country. Why didn't they see this? The reason they didn't see this is because they've been so focused on water quality. And they hadn't really put together the fact that they were developing this very significant choke point in the Yellow River Basin. Because there they'd been also about water supply to get that river to the ocean. The other thing is that they've, in 10 years, they've tripled the amount of energy they've had to produce. So that this has happened. They're dealing with the velocity of change too.
And just to jump in there, that one thing that I'm hoping to do, this time we hung out more with the hydrologists, but I basically want to be a matchmaker and get the Chinese water and energy researchers to talk to each other.
Can I say one more question about this? In Choke Point, U.S., which in the United States we have also very significant choke points developing, confrontations developing between water and energy in our fastest growing and driest regions as well. And we wanted to test the politics of this, so we sent a team into Kern County as part of our Choke Point U.S. to look at what happens when you have water scarcity, when the agriculture is fighting the energy guys. And we went to Kern County. Kern County has been a focus of a very significant drought. Well, the agriculture there is a multi-billion-dollar business. So you have billionaire farmers and you have billionaire oil producers. The agriculture interests, their allotments in water were cut back as much as 80% over the last 3-4 years. Some of those years they get 80% cuts. The oil guys, nothing, not a drop. We found the same thing in China. China's new leadership, it comes out of the power sector. So when push comes to shove between the food production and the energy production, energy is primary. It has primacy over food production. It's really surprising in a country that sees food security as a high priority. But in the Yellow River Basin, we did a really, really fascinating article also by Nadia that says, okay, the energy guys are in confrontation with the ag guys over scarce water reserves. What happened? Well, the energy guys invested a lot of money in irrigation conservation, water conservation and irrigation, hardening up those. And all that water saved, 100 million cubic meters a year, went into the Ningdong energy base. So the farmers in Ningxia have 30%, their allotments have been cut 30%. They figured out how to grow the same amount of food with less water. But that water, which was commoditized, went to the energy sector. And that's a really significant thing in the Yellow River, because it's a big food bowl, and it's also a huge energy production sector. And so that's where their biggest choke point is going to be, is who's going to get that water. Well, we know who's going to get the water.
And Nadia's story also talked about how these water trades, as they call them, they are officially illegal, but of course in China, ever so innovative, made it a pilot program. And so, but again, we are going to see, again, from the nerdy water side, we are probably going to see China eventually revising their water law, because they are going to need to make this nationwide, that you can have investments into ag from industry to rationalize water. Okay, coal guys.
Sure. On the reserves, most of the studies I've seen point to slightly less than 50 years to a little over 100 years. But the issue, as you pointed out, is coal quality. How much of that is really of a quality that's useful? On the carbon capture and storage, if you use a traditional pulverized coal, you're burning the coal, you're right, it takes about 30 to 40% extra energy just to run the carbon capture equipment. If you use something like an IGCC, an integrated gasification combined cycle, where you gasify the coal and then burn that synthetic gas, there your penalty is about 10 to 15%. So it's a much lower penalty there. The discrepancy, though, between that extra energy use and the extra water consumption is partly to cool the equipment that separates the CO2. So you've got more water demand there, as well as more water demand for the higher amount of coal and the cooling of the boiler water. So if you package it all together, it's 50 to 100% extra. And a large part of that is cooling of the separation technologies.
Okay, so now we're coming to an energy guru to ask a question.
My name is Lulu Fauzi from U.S. Energy Information Administration. Well, Jennifer, thank you for really organizing this panel, and this topic is very interesting, but I'm a little bit not disappointed, but because the presentation you gave was very compelling, especially Keith, when you were talking about all what we have done in China. But I have a question. How do you get your source for the projection of installed capacity of 1900 by 2020? We're talking 9 years from now.
1,900 gigawatts
Yes.
came out of the National Energy Administration in China.
Because this is very high. Even when I look at their official forecast, they don't go beyond 1,600. So I would like to reduce
1,600 by,
by 2020.
that's not a right number.
Yeah. Anyway, so I would like to see if there is a
Okay.
breakdown of this. The other issue about, you know, that the Chinese, that they have caught the fever of what the U.S. has been doing here for biofuel and ethanol and biodiesel, which requires water. And the other issue, the shale gas, you know, game changer in the U.S. And the debate here, at least domestically, it's about what you are going to do about the issue of water. So the Chinese, too, they have more shale resources than the United States. And this week they started selecting companies who are going to develop those shale resources. So
Right.
the issue water is very important, you know, issue. So how do you think that the Chinese are going to solve this issue?
I think the Chinese are going to solve this issue because they're going to do something much different than we did, which is to exempt our energy industry from having to treat or recycle that water. What we were told in both Chengdu and in Beijing, by the way, I was in Chengdu, little story, I had breakfast with a bunch of young executives from Caterpillar who were there at the same time. And we were talking about what they're crawling all over Sichuan province, where Shell is now beginning to do its work on shale gas. And they were telling me how excited they were about what's happening there, because essentially producing oil and natural gas from these unconventional reserves is essentially a mining operation. I mean, they mine with water, but it's a mining operation, and their equipment is there to use. And they were explaining this, and then they asked me what I did, and I told them I wasn't going to lie to them. I told them I was a journalist, and very quickly one had to go to the bathroom and one had to go to the summer. And in that 30 seconds, I was alone. But they're going to. We're anticipating, and they made no announcement, but we anticipate also through some of the experts that we met, where Jeremy is going to school, that they're going to recycle. They're going to require recycling, so that water is going to be treated and recycled. And that's especially important in the north, but even in Sichuan, which has a lot of water. And in the United States, by the way, when the Bush 1 administration came to power, you know, they had those energy meetings, right? I don't know what they call the energy conferences. Well, one of the things they were doing is getting the justification, legal justification, the political strategy to exempt our natural gas producers from Safe Drinking Water Act. It's pretty significant. Play. The last thing I'm going to say about this is now becoming a confrontation point, a political point in the northern Great Plains and in the West, because not only is North Dakota becoming the fourth largest oil producing state in the United States now, and quickly becoming to 2. 1,300 oil wells were drilled in North Dakota last year. Natural gas is also a big player, and each of those wells takes 5 to 7 million gallons of water to produce, to frack that. And all that water, or most of that water, has to be brought back to the surface, and we're not requiring any recycling or treatment yet. Well, from an industrial point of view and a political point of view, that's stupid, because what you also learn when you go to China, you come back to the United States, is China's all about going, doing. U.S. processes at this point is all about stopping and don't. Well, it's equally possible for the energy industry's development out there to be tied up in all kinds of lawsuits and all kinds of regulatory issues around water, which, if you look at the value of that oil and natural gas, the cost of treating it, right, and recycling it is a pittance. It's a pittance. Some of those wells out there, 4,000 barrels a day at $100 a day. What's that? $400,000 a day. What would it cost them to treat that water, Mr. EPA?
I'm an air guy.
Oh wait, do I have
No.
a water person out in the audience?
So I think politically they're making a really significant mistake, and in China they're going to require recycling.
Just to follow up quickly, I don't want one message. I have been also covering China for the last 8 years, but there is always tendency to underestimate energy efficiency in the long term and technology improvement. And in my view, and even with LBL, latest studies about powers and others, it's wrong to assume that this trend will continue that way. So for some journalists like you or analysts like you, it's very important to understand that energy efficiency and technology improvement can make a difference in China. So exaggerating the whole issue, even though it's an issue, but exaggerating it may discredit the whole issue that they are facing. Like,
Well, let me push back on you on that. I don't think we're exaggerating anything. I think our data is really sound. And I think a nation that produces 660 million metric tons of steel, that's no exaggeration. That's what they're doing now. I used to have the cement numbers. But any nation that's capable of producing 660 million metric tons of steel, that's no exaggeration. They use a ton of coal and they're using a ton of water. And this isn't an exaggeration. These are the best numbers that are out there. Why do we know that? Because we went and got them. And in China, you have to go. It's the Woody Allen effect. 80% of success is showing up. So none of us sat in a office behind a desk doing Google. We went out and got these numbers. And so when you say 1,600 and I say 1,900, we're in the same ballpark. I think my number is better than your numbers. But I got them. I went out and got them. I got them off the desks of the people that told me that's what's happening,
But it was also important too, because in terms of that, the data was, because we were asked that in China as well, and we said,
in my business, there's the IWT factor. I was there.
Okay.
So
we got a question there. Hey, Helen.
Helen Rafael, Resources for the Future. You really are heroes, by the way. It's wonderful. But I have two questions and a quick comment. One question is, you haven't said anything about development of batteries to store the solar energy, and it seems to me that in some time in the future, electric cars, instead of just plugging in and using the coal to produce the electricity, might be using very, very efficient batteries that can be exchanged at stations. Is there anything on battery production? That's my first question. My second is that I'm shocked to hear about how much hydropower dams are being in the works, because it's going to cut off water to Myanmar, pardon me, I almost said Burma, and to the Mekong, to Southeast Asia and so forth. And those are really serious economic and political questions. My quick comment is that in the 1970s, when I was working across the street in the Commerce Department, we heard that the Ogallala aquifer in the United States was drying up. And that, of course, is a big source of a lot of agricultural water in the mid portion of the United States. I haven't read your Choke Point US, but I assume that we here are experiencing the same choking off of water as in China. And is there any way for us to cooperate with China, because we're facing the very same problems, dependence on coal and lack of water?
Well, I can make a comment about the battery storage, and I think that's an essential element of a more sustainable energy future. I was at a conference a couple months ago here in D.C., where there was a representative from EARPA, which is the equivalent of DARPA. It's kind of the deep skunk works looking at energy breakthrough technologies. And he said that one of the most promising areas that they're investigating now is the one of battery storage technology. And that absolutely, what's the biggest concern about renewables, and particularly wind and solar, is that they're not baseload. You can't rely on them. And that, as the battery technology improves, that's going to start to overcome that. I'm convinced. I'm convinced that we're losing ground both in China and the U.S. So while these improvements are significant, including energy efficiency and some of the other improvements in technology, it still remains an enormous challenge. And certainly no one technology improvement is going to resolve it.
you had two other pieces about the Ogallala and then about hydro in China. First, the Ogallala. Already in the northern Great Plains, there are confrontations between ranchers and municipal water utility districts and the oil and natural gas industry over water supply. And those will get more fierce. They're starting now. They'll get more fierce, even though North Dakota is one of the few states in the country that has a budget surplus and where the energy boom there is, fueling massive, very large investments and job growth. The reason that is because water is seen as, a really valuable commons resource. Again, when agriculture and an energy industry tangle over water, we know who's going to win that struggle, but that doesn't mean that the people are going to lay over. So you heard it here first. You're going to hear this summer, this spring, this summer, and in the fall, more about this confrontation. One thing we want to say more about that. In Choke Point, U.S., we were the first news organization in the country that described the dimension of the hydrocarbon development boom in the middle of the continent, from the tar sands all the way to the Gulf. And when we were here in September, people were going, well, how come we don't know anything about that? And our response was, you will, and we are. And the national media is now talking a lot about this, and we'll talk more about this. And the energy industry faces some fairly serious political confrontation. As I say, our system is built for veto, so we have lots of veto power. And for them to mismanage this water resource and to bully people is not what people in North Dakota or those folks are going to want to hear. And there's ways to push back, and there's going to be pushback this summer about that. On the hydro development, you're absolutely right. The next project that we want to do, we've been talking about it, for weeks now, is to go in and look at the consequences of the hydropower development in southwest China, and the consequences cross-border. And there's very significant. And the U.S. government has been over there. The State Department, we met with one of the State Department aides, diplomats in Chengdu, which is in Sichuan, about this. And they're very concerned about it for obvious reasons, because China is really not that sensitive, not nearly as sensitive as they need to be about what they're doing upriver from their downriver neighbors. And we've done some work on this at Circle of Blue, but we've not done send in teams really take a look at this, and we'd love to do that. But it is a very significant, increasing global issue. And the last piece is that the supply of that water is in doubt, because the Himalayas are melting faster than almost any place on Earth. Yeah. And the Himalayas are the mother source of so many of those rivers.
Jeremy, did you have anything to add?
Sure, I'll just add on the cooperation front. There are a number of activities going on between both governments, looking at new technologies that use water more efficiently. But I think really the biggest opportunity is the commercial opportunity. Our two governments can work together on pilots and programs, but if somebody identifies the technology and believes there's a commercial market for it, that's going to be deployed a lot faster, and it's going to have a much bigger impact. And I think we're seeing that. Just looking at, for example, the issue of dry cooling at coal-fired power plants. Many of the U.S. companies that build some of those technologies, more than 3/4 of their business is coming from China. And that's led to, as they continue to do more research and development, they're able to use those technologies on larger plants.
Yeah. And it's not just the technology producers that are collaborating. We work in the utility sector with American Electric Power, among others. I know AEP, Duke Energy, and others are visiting China. They don't have operations there, they don't have investments there, but what they do have is a desire to learn and teach, right? And so it's not just us teaching them by far. It's this collaboration and information exchange that's going both ways.
And last, we're just like fighting for the microphone here. Yes, you go. You're the...
Yeah, well, I would also kind of to expand on that. Because of the rapid growth in China and the ease with which they can do pilots and experiments and the willingness to invest in those pilots and experiments, it can be a testing ground in a way that we can't really do things at the speed and scale here, at that speed and scale in the U.S. So there's a lot that there are market opportunities for U.S. companies. Similarly, there are going to be market opportunities in the U.S. for Chinese companies that are working on these technologies. But it's also a chance to for accelerating R&D.
Yeah, and there is, and under the, well, you go. You ask some questions. I'll talk more about the U.S.-China cooperation in a bit. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Peter Geib from Minnesota State University. I teach international business out there. And I am right on the North Dakota-Minnesota border, and we, of course, are living what you're talking about, and particularly, well, all of you, but particularly Jeremy. And I am just very curious if you might elaborate any more on what you see as the business opportunities, particularly for small and medium-sized enterprises. And secondly, how do you talked about risk assessment for business. How would you establish priorities regarding that? I know you don't want to get into nuts and bolts too much, but if you would have any just brief comments on that, it would be. I assure you, I will take them back home.
And you can tackle him gently after the meeting too. But yeah, give us some thoughts here.
The market for more efficient, both water and energy efficient devices is exploding. It'll continue to explode. It's moving, well beyond the market here in the U.S. And as we can see, that opportunity in China is even bigger and will last longer, I think, than it has in the U.S. And there's an interesting dance going on between small businesses or social entrepreneurs and big corporations, right? And that's a real challenge, because if you want to get to scale, quite often it means you need to link up with large businesses, but they can crush you as well as a small business. And so that's difficult to be able to maintain your independence and your IP and your ability to prosper and at the same time reach scale. One of the things that's really interesting right now that I see going on I'll call it a small business, but it's a research collaboration between Craig Ventnor and the work that he's done with genetics. He's now applying that to algae and producing fuel from algae, and he's linked up with ExxonMobil. I think they provided something like a $400 million commitment. So that's an example of a link up that could create some really amazing breakthroughs from a technology standpoint. I'm not one to address the question of how do I take my small business to China, but I do know that just as that was once a place to get cheap labor, it's now an enormous opportunity to sell your products.
If I can jump in with the U.S.-China, with the Obama-WHO 2009 clean energy agreements. They created the CERC, which are these research centers that they're not bricks and mortars. It's basically there's these three consortia. One's around electric vehicles, another one cleaner coal, mainly CCS, and then green buildings. I'm looking in the back of the room at my green building guy there, and we're going to have a meeting green buildings about this, what's going on in this. But these consortia include businesses, NGOs, and national laboratories, and that's kind of an opportunity too to be bringing these sectors together to cooperate, look at technologies, look at opportunities, and do pilots. And also, but there are also countless. I mean, AmCham has got the ECP, the Energy Conservation Program thing. Basically, we're having the business NGOs and business organizations in the U.S. are all doing kind of clean energy initiatives in China, and so trying to get their members there. And so that's another kind of opportunity. Even U.S.-China Business Council, the Shanghai office, they're particularly, I think, kind of innovative in doing meetings and educating members on the opportunities for clean and green business opportunities in China. Okay, some other questions out there. Right down in the front row. These are good questions. A little hard sometimes. It's good. Okay, this one will be really hard, I'm sure.
Thank you, Jennifer. Don't oversell me. It's Margaret Ryan. I'm an energy journalist. And Keith, since you were talking about all the numbers you were able to get, you also mentioned China's investment in solar and wind. And I wondered if you were able to get any numbers on the productivity of their solar and wind. You mentioned gigawatt, but not gigawatt hours. We have problems in the U.S. with the capacity for wind, the capability being stuck at around 30%, and solar PV is even lower. Do you have any idea if they're getting better productivity out of their wind and solar?
My sense is they're getting less productivity because they're about 30. They have 42 or 3 gigawatts of generating capacity of wind, for instance, and their wind council said that they're 30% behind in cooking it up. We went to Gansu, where American Electric Power is helping the state grid company, and I think that's what they call themselves, the state grid,
Yeah, stay good.
hook up a 750 million kilovolt power line, transmission line. You could actually see it coming across the mountains while we were there. So in Gansu, they have 5.5 gigs, and it's hooked up to the grid. And the state grid, from what we were told by Gansu provincial authorities, is really reluctant. They're jittery about this because it's hard to measure in the peaking of the wind. What was the other the productivity, the efficiency?
Just generally, U.S. gets about 30% capacity factor on average out of its wind, and there's a lot of push to try to raise that. I just wondered what they're getting in China. If you had any
I do have that number, but it's not in my head, believe it or not. And by the way, your question about how you do business in China, on the transactional side, put your liver and your kidneys into, serious get in shape. Because baiju is a big deal there. and doing business all there is about getting seriously messed up at night. So if you go and get a really good fixer translator.
Yeah. There you go. Do we got some questions? Some other questions? Oh, over this side of the room. We'll get Sifei will get it. Yeah, it's on.
Yeah, Paul Gruber with the National Groundwater Association. Most of you address the issue of water use in your discussions. There's a big impact on water quality, probably a big impact on ecosystems. I imagine there's a lot of water transfer between basins in China. We're experiencing some of those same problems here in the U.S. I was wondering if you could address that as well.
Maybe you can help us on the groundwater stuff.
Now, just the water transfers. Yeah.
Well, they're moving, as I said, the South-North water transfer is probably the largest water transfer project in the world. And it's causing jitters in both the North and the South. In the North, it's causing problems because they're anticipating a very significant increase in the price of water. And so Beijing, for instance, and Tianjin started to desalinate water. And if you go through that energy, conversion equation in dollars, that's a pretty interesting response. And in the South, we were in Shanghai, and we talked to a state-run research institute and the agencies that both treat wastewater and supply municipal water to the industries and residences. And both of them were consistent about how nervous they were about how much water was being transferred from the south to the north because they understand that the moisture levels in those rivers is going down. That surprised me because I figure you're going to spend $66 billion on a piece of infrastructure that's going to work, move a lot of water. And in the north, the transfer that we found was again in Ningxia, and it was transferred from agriculture to energy. So the energy interests were very concerned because Ningxia has a 4 billion cubic meter allotment from the Yellow River, which is their main water supply, and they needed 100 million cubic meters to supply the Ningdong base for the apparatus that they were building at the time, and so they hardened the irrigation. Well, that put a lot of pressure on the ag interests, on the farmers, to be as productive or more productive using 30% less water, but it was a good deal for the energy guys. So that's where we found the transfer. Did we find any other transfers?
Well, the Bohai, your big Bohai story.
Oh God!
See, we've done too many stories. It's like the crazy thing is we promised, the Energy Foundation we'd do a story a week, and afterwards, like, why do we say a story a week?
Yeah,
we're doing a story a week.
The other one is we did find a big story. The other one, which is not just China, but it's also Australia, and we're watching this in the Midwest because of this very significant energy development, fossil fuel development, unconventional fuel development in Rocky Mountain West and North Dakota and the Great Plains. So there's a proposal been knocking around for a long time in China since the late 90s, which was first proposed by a geographer named Hu Yonggang at Xi'an University to essentially build a pipeline from the Bohai Sea and run it up to Shilanhot, about 600 kilometers in eastern Inner Mongolia, and then rip it across Inner Mongolia and Gansu into Xi'an. Xi'an also has Xinjiang, sorry. Has these huge reserves. And these huge reserves, there's no agreement about how much coal China has because the geographers in these universities that we visited said there's so much coal out there, there's like thousands of years of coal, trillions of cubic yards of coal, metric tons of coal. So I don't know about the coal. They got a lot of coal. But in order to get that coal, they've run into this choke point, so they need more water. So right now at the NDRC level, and at the provincial level in eastern Inner Mongolia and in Shilanhot at the municipal level, working with these geographers at Xi'an University and at Beijing, they're beginning to plan this 600-kilometer pipeline, which dips in the Bohai Sea, runs the water up 5,000 feet over a kilometer, and sends it into Shilanhot, and they'll treat it, they'll desalinate it at the sea level in desal plants, and it's going to take a nuclear power plant to do all that. But if you do all the math on that, says this geographer, and he did a little bit of the cost, it will cash flow because the value of that coal is so high, and they need that water. Australia has two proposals like this: seawater pipelines from the coast to fuel to provide moisture to Australian mines to bring coal to China. And we're waiting for the first proposal out of Lake Superior for the water pipeline into the Dakotas. We're waiting for that. I mean, it won't surprise us if that happens.
Some other question. Oh, there's Lindsay.
Hi, Lindsay Eckelman with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I want to actually follow up on what you were just talking about. Could you, I've noticed that, yes, Xinjiang is a huge area, and as is Inner Mongolia, for development of coal, which is going to take a lot of water. Now, actually, one of the larger water reserves in that region is actually in Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. And I wondered if China, if anyone you met was thinking about putting together water transfer projects that would go internationally in that area.
Where were the places?
Xinjiang, out in Xinjiang, whether or not.
Well, the Western Canal of the.
No, but she's. I don't think we've heard any yet. But again, there and I would find that very, very sensitive. I haven't heard that yet, but I think the bigger issues is more like sometimes China tends to send more water pollution to its neighbors in the river. But I haven't heard about transfer. But we could start
cross borders.
Cross border. We can start. You see, now you planted the seed in his head. He's gonna go check that out. Haven't heard of anything, but just to keep in mind too that also the Western Canal would be taking waters ostensibly from Tibet, that canal is I mean, they say it's going to go forward, but it's going to take a lot of energy. I mean, that's moving a lot of water, but that is really also to take it up to Xinjiang, not necessarily to serve big cities, but to serve the development of coal in the Western.
And the folks that we talked to, Nadia talked to them, said that they're going to go forward with the Western Canal, but it hasn't become official. Well, why? Because they need the water.
They need the water, and also that just to kind of bring into some of the questions like your shale gas, a lot's in Sichuan. They want to transfer water out of the basin. They're also building lots of dams. There's a huge clash of infrastructure, and the problem is that you have different government bureaucracies working on all these tracks, and something's going to give, and I don't know what it is, but I have a few, depending on the timing, could be the Western Canal. Some other questions out there. I had one right in the middle there.
Hi, Wynette Yao with Getzel's Gordon Production. I'm a documentary filmmaker, developing some shows in China right now, one of which is the water transfer project, water diversion. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about it, just some basics. How many thousands of miles do they intend to transport this water? The fundamental question, just even from an engineering point of view, does it work? Is it going to work? And then some follow-on questions about whether how they're addressing pollution and evaporation. And then back to the question of, what if the South and their supply of water is being threatened, how does this affect their plans to go forward? Is it likely to interrupt it, or are they just going to keep going?
Can you help us with this? Yeah,
South North.
Do it up here so they can put you on camera. So Nadia did our South North and with Aaron, and I can help her with some. But you have the numbers, how long it is?
Well, it's over 1,000 for sure, but it's from Henan. So the central line is from Henan province, which is in central eastern China, to Beijing and Tianjin, and the Eastern Canal is from
ostensibly from Shanghai.
Yeah, ostensibly from Shanghai to Tianjin. So if you know China's geography, I don't know the exact numbers right now, but they're technically possible. I mean, they're under construction. They'll be completed by 2014. We actually went under there's a tunnel under the Yellow River, which is part of the Central Canal, and it's they digged 70 meters deep, and it's almost 4 kilometers long. It goes under the Yellow River because they don't want to mix the Yangtze River water with the Yellow River because it's very polluted. So it's technically possible, and it will be done by they say 2014. Yeah.
I mean, China's never. I mean, the Ministry of Water Resources. These guys. I mean, they've never met an infrastructure project they didn't like, and it is doable. And some of the canals, trying to use gravity. I mean, so it's saying that they don't want to have to pump it. But clearly, the Western Canal. Well, the Western Canal, that one, it's coming from the Himalayas, so it's coming down. But that one would have to drill through mountains, and they say it's technically feasible. But again, that one could take decades to put in.
And the other responses to technical questions you were asking, we have a piece that's all about this that was like the second or third piece in the series. And the Eastern Canal is too polluted to use. So there's over 400 treatment plants on the Eastern Canal, which use a ton of energy to treat that water. And then the amount of energy just to lift the water, because they have to lift the water, was the equivalent to what the power generated by, I think, a 600 megawatt power plant. And we have those conversions, and those conversions were prepared with the help of Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory about how much energy it was taking. And you had another couple. Evaporation. We don't have evaporation number out of that.
Basically, come see us later, and we'll introduce you to people in the mafia.
The brilliance of the central one is that it doesn't use any energy to move. It's all gravity flow.
Yeah, it's all gravity.
So.
And that's what they say about the western one, if it gets built. But it will be very challenging because it goes through mountains. That's and it has to connect from one river and then build a canal and then go to another river and all the way through mountains.
And the Sichuan provincial government, when we were there, we had several sources tell us that the Sichuan provincial government is really concerned about these transfers because of their concerns about the dropping moisture levels in that province. And we have those numbers as well about how much moisture they're losing in that one. We have how much moisture they're losing province by province for 10 years, which goes to the fact that we were there, we got those numbers.
Well, there have been, these projects did, some of them a little bit later, they did actually end up doing environmental impact assessments for the first two. And the second one, the middle one, has been somewhat delayed, partially with some hiccups with relocating. But they're not relocating nearly as many people as the Three Gorges Dam. But again, there's not, where do you relocate these people to? Because there's a lot of, a lot of these are farmers. But, the necessity is there. And so I can really see the first two will happen. Second one, we wait and see. I had another question over on this side of the room, I think, or back down front. Okay, got it. We have time for a couple more questions.
Just quickly, several of the answers raised desalination, and that wasn't addressed during the main presentations. Can you tell us anything about what China is doing, if anything, in looking at using seawater desalination for whether it's for the drinking water in their cities or to take back in for agriculture or other uses?
They're not looking at desalination for any sorts of large-scale industrial agricultural use because it's still very expensive technology. Looking at it to produce water for their cities, as many others. Desal is one of the biggest industrial development, sectors in the world right now. And last year we did a piece for Circle of Blue about that because we kind of tripped over at Melbourne, where Melbourne built huge desal plant. Of course, Melbourne is the most affected industrial country in the world by climate change, and they're using the dirtiest coal in the world to fuel the electricity to desal Melbourne. So it makes the whole desal loop is really troublesome, and China understands that. But again, they're nervous about the cost of the water in the south-north transfer, which is going to be more expensive. What's the number on that? Do you remember?
How much the water will cost?
More water will cost? Yeah. So it's going to cost them significantly more when they finally get it done to the major cities. And so Beijing and Tianjin are both looking at building major desal plants. And, by electricity. Probably coal, maybe we didn't talk a lot about nuclear. Could be nuclear.
Could be nuclear.
China's now generating 13 gigs of power, 13,000 megawatts of power from its roughly 13 plants. They put 2 plants online since we've done this project. They had 11 last year. I think they now have 13. And they want to produce at least 50 gigawatts of nuclear power by the end of the decade. It could be more. They had anticipated what we were being told in country was that most of those plants are scheduled to be seawater cooled, built along the coast and seawater cooled. Now, after Japan, they put that program under review. The DOE, when you put a program under review, it disappears. But in China, we don't know what that means. But we're anticipating in China they're going to move ahead of that. I mean, Westinghouse alone has 9 power plants under construction or development or design in China. So they're building nuclear power, but it's still that 50 or 60 gigs is a small portion of what the EIA says is 1,600, and what Circle of Booth says is 1,900 gigawatts of power that they're going to be producing at the end of the decade, and still a very small portion. And the southern sector is now pushing, from what we were said, to build some of those plants inland on those rivers. But we were only able to find one that was planned inland off the coast. So I don't know what's going to happen with nuclear power, but it makes sense because it replaces, hundreds of millions of tons of coal if you generate from nukes. And then GE told us that they didn't really want to get involved in the nuclear sector there because they were nervous about just what happened. They're nervous about the long-term risk. But Westinghouse is all over it. We were told by an engineer who's involved in that they're building them so fast that Westinghouse can't keep up with the design drawings out of Pittsburgh.
And, Jeremy, can I ask you, with saltwater cooling, saltwater cooling for nuclear power plants, are they also cooling coal-fired power plants with saltwater? And is that easy, efficient?
Well, you can certainly do that. I think the key thing is the salt water is more corrosive, so you're talking about a different material that you're using in the cooling system to construct the cooling system. I'm not aware of any saltwater cooling coal-fired power plants on the coast of China, but I wouldn't be surprised if you told me there were.
Okay.
And where they're testing the coal. They're testing the coal combustion of electrical production from coal that uses salt water. In Tianjin, an American company, Peabody, and 6 Chinese utilities and government power companies are building GreenGen, which is a demonstration gasification plant that is both seawater cooled and freshwater cooled to test both systems. Pretty smart in a demonstration plant. See which one really works. Mm-hmm. That plant, when I visited in October, they build things in China 24/7. So on a national holiday, there were 2,000 people building this plant, and that thing was going up. It was amazing, and it's probably done by now. It's supposed to be supposed to open at the end of the year.
We're decommissioned.
Shoot, they get stuff built there. It takes us, we basically finished the permits. It's all done. We were in Beijing, and we were meeting with diplomats at the American embassy who live out there. And they were talking about this subway line, this elevated subway line, of a new subway line. And they're like, oh, yeah, well, one day we kind of looked over there, and there it was. It took them 18 months to build, and that was 18 months to build this elevated subway line, from downtown all the way out past the airport. Oh, yeah, it just happened.
Okay, so over here we got another question. We have time for about 2 more quick questions because then I have to kidnap everybody and take them up to the hill. Talk up there. All right.
All right, I'll make my question quick. I'm Michael from the Natural Resources Defense Council. We talked a lot about coal use in China, but I think only about 50% of coal use in China is for power generation. And the rest of 50% is used as direct fuel in industry and other places. And besides the pilot CTL plant that was scrapped, what do you see going forward as, this is, I guess, a primary question for Jeremy, what do you see going forward as sort of the water implications of expanding coal as a non-power generation, because we have increasing pollution controls and all these other things that could be a very large water barrier. But in terms of life cycle costs and
let me update your numbers on the coal. 2/3 of China's coal is used for power generation. That's 2 billion. Of the next billion, about half of it is used for cement, coking, industrial production. And half of that, the 500 million, 460 million metric tons of that is used for coal conversion. Most of it coal for chemicals. The coal to liquids is kind of in abeyance. China it produces a ton of ammonia and urea by gasifying coal. Lots of it. And we have a whole piece before the last piece about all of the coal gasification, 460 million metric tons of a lot of coal. And it uses a ton of water. The coal conversion, the water conversion from coal to liquids in that new plant is 4 million metric tons of coal, 1 million metric tons of fuel, and 10 to 12 million metric tons of water to cool. And it's worse for the coal to chemicals. It's like 1 to 15, 1 to 18. It's in that piece.
And the coal to chemicals is just, it's going to keep growing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're making olefins, methanol. I mean, they just have a huge coal to chemicals because they're really nervous about petrochemical or petroleum imports.
Yeah, and if you look at many of the chemicals that we have in the U.S., we base them on petroleum or natural gas. So a lot of the ammonia, that's where it's coming from. China is the vast majority of it. I don't have the specific percentage, but the vast majority of those chemicals is coming from coal. Demand for all those chemicals, whether they're used in industrial processes, fertilizers, or NOx control technologies, the demands are increasing, and they're increasing rapidly. So I would anticipate the coal to chemicals conversion will. I wouldn't be surprised if it outstrips electricity generation, because it's growing very rapidly.
And the other piece that we found, again, from being there, we didn't visit this plant, but talked to engineers. They have 4 plants, 4 places in China now that have what they call in situ gasification, which I describe as essentially taking a coal seam, lighting it at one end, throwing a bunch of oxygen, and harvesting the gases at the other, where they gasify. The one that they have in Inner Mongolia, which was produced, which is the oldest, which is ENN's plant, which is a private Chinese energy company, has a gasification plant. But the gas is already, they separate the gases. The CO2 is going into an algae production facility for biodiesel, which is pretty interesting. And then the gases go into the other side for coal to chemicals. But so they're saving water on the whole coal processing, combustion, all of that. So there's a lot of water saving. This is the middle of the desert. And there's 3 others that have been approved. And help me, maybe Mr. Do you know how many of those coal in situ plants are actually up and operating? I know one's in western Inner Mongolia. I think one's in Xinjiang. And I can't remember where the 4th is, but they've got 4, and the oldest is in eastern Inner Mongolia. Now think about that in the United States. Anybody propose anything that looks like this? We're going to light that coal seam. We're going to stoke it with oxygen. We're going to harvest the gas, and the people will go, what?
Have you done your EIA?
but in China, they're so devoted or obligated to coal over at least the next decade, when their non-fossil fuel sector is clearly going to catch coal production at some point in the late 2020s, it looks like. But until then, they're beholden to coal. They're using coal every way that they can think about it, and they have the highest technology, highest risk, highest entrepreneurial spirit in the world about how they're going to use their coal. And Jeff told you, Jeremy told you about their CCS. Well, it's tiny, but at least they're doing it.
Yeah. Well, it's growing. It's expected to grow significantly.
Okay, got any other question out there? Maybe last one. Oh, of course. See, it's, if the journalists in the room don't ask questions, it's kind of like really bad. No. We hadn't succeeded.
Congratulations! This is an excellent presentation. I'm so happy for you guys. I wondered, Keith, if you could tell me what in your reporting surprised you. Maybe something where you had a hypothesis or something that someone would expect going in that you found out, no, it's something different.
Well, we didn't know what we'd find. We just knew we'd find something. And the fact that we were able to put together these numbers that hadn't been seen, or we updated very significant numbers. We identified this very significant choke point, really significant choke point in the Yellow River Valley. So, I thought that was pretty cool. We were able to make that case and then bring that knowledge to top-level government agencies, including the Ministry of Water Resources, who really hadn't been thinking about this and told us that they need to shift and transition how they think about that and what they're going to do to solve it. I think that's enormous as a journalist, as you know. Yeah. And on the surprising thing, do you want the hour-long visit? I'm going to be very careful about this. I'm very impressed by China, and I understand all of the push and pull and dimensions and the toilet culture and the compartmentalization of information and how they don't speak to each other and the human rights and all that stuff. But I went to Shanghai. And if you go to Shanghai, you get really impressed by what they're doing. And I came away from this trip, and this is the third long trip I've done in 6 months, with the following thought, and then I'll shut up. When I was a kid, the view of Hollywood and novelists about what would happen when large amounts of people would scrap over scarce resources was disaster, right? It was Armageddon. It was disorder and decay. Well, China's put the myth to that, because this country, I'm going to be very careful here. This country is making it happen, and they're making it happen for a lot of people. And there are a lot of people in China that we met that are really enthusiastic about the fact that they're building this country. And as I said before, Jennifer, midway through started talking about, you guys have to do this better. And I'm the most skeptical journalist that one can have, or one of them, right? So that's in our blood. And I'm not a pessimist that they can solve this. I really think that they have a government system that, with all of its negatives, they have a government system that can respond to the velocity of change that we're now in. And that's why I'm optimistic. And I think that they're showing us some ways about how to do things that I say every American needs to go there, and we stop this nonsense about gay marriage or whatever,
Okay, one thing I wanted to say that in doing, because I've been doing the China Environment Forum for almost 12 years now, and generally I say my network, everyone's very generous with their time, but when we agreed, it was kind of crazy. We did this it was like doing this project was like Energy Foundation gave us money, we're going now. We got the money in November, and in December I had to set up 3 weeks of interviews, and I'm pretty good, but I was like, am I this good? But then what I found was that when I emailed people, and because some of the questions that they were looking into, I didn't know people, but I had friends. My line is generally, I know someone who knows someone, and the enthusiasm. I mean, I sometimes was going 2 people away from the person I knew, and they're like, "We welcome Circle of Blue." I'm like, really? Okay, good. And so, and then, so it wasn't just the response when we gave the presentations, but the fact that people are maybe they are seeing, like Ken was saying, how could they not be seeing this? And I think that, in the gut, you kind of know this problem's coming down the pike, but again, no one has brought the data together, and that's what we're trying to do. And I think that also, hopefully, that people see that we were coming there, addressing water in China. Okay, so much of the international cooperation focuses on energy and climate, which the Chinese suspect is probably we're hitting them over the head, right? Their pollution, their CO2 emissions. But really, when you engage in any country, and I think Circle of Blue's found this, when you go and talk to people about water, you're not bringing your international agenda. You're bringing it home to the people, and I think that's also a topic that I think that's what I think has made this a successful project so far, and we're hoping that the China Environment Forum, we want to keep this partnership going, and we want to go down south in China and look at shale, oil, natural gas issues, and ag. We have Keith here's got to write that ag story next, but because ag is a big story, and we're not and keep in mind that these stories, while they're rich, it's still the dragonfly touching the water, right? That we haven't dug deep enough yet. And so, again, I'm throwing it out to all of you people who work on China energy and environmental issues, that you guys got to pick up the pieces of this story that are relevant for the work that you're doing. So we're gonna end here, but first I'd like you guys to please applaud the superheroes up front here.